On July 6, 2026, at 02:17 hours local time, somewhere over the dark surface of the Sea of Azov, 19 sanctioned fuel tankers were moving toward occupied Crimea. They carried the lifeblood of Russia's war machine under foreign flags, hidden behind shell companies, invisible to sanctions enforcement. These were not ordinary merchant ships. Each was a link in a supply chain that kept Russian armored units fueled, Russian aircraft airborne, and Russian forces on the southern front operational. Together, they represented nearly 70% of Moscow's oil export capacity. A floating sanctions evasion network worth billions, built over 2 years to ensure the war could continue regardless of what the West decided. Russia's commanders believed the Azov Sea was safe. Shallow, enclosed, surrounded by occupied coastline. They had decided it was a protected lake, a rear area logistics corridor beyond the reach of Ukrainian strike capability. They had no idea that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces had been watching every vessel, mapping every route, logging every transit for weeks. They had no idea what was already in the water. In the next 4 days, that assumption would be destroyed, along with 30 ships. 41 Magura V5 unmanned surface vehicles launched from concealed positions along the Ukrainian-controlled coastline at 01:44 hours, already racing toward the Shadow Fleet's transit corridor. At the same time, 2 waves of fixed-wing strike drones lifted off from forward staging areas near Zaporizhzhia, climbing to low cruise altitude and turning southeast. This was not a single strike. It was a campaign. 3 nights, multiple units, coordinated targeting across an entire maritime logistics network. The operation involved 3 units, drone formations Kairos and Raid, and the first UAV center. Each had a specific role. Kairos handled the deep maritime strikes. Raid managed approach corridor suppression. The first UAV center ran the parallel inland campaign, targeting power substations across occupied Crimea to compound the disruption. What was about to begin was the largest sustained naval drone offensive since the war started. To understand why this operation mattered, you need to understand what the Shadow Fleet actually was and what it was doing in the Azov. After Western sanctions cut off Russia's ability to move oil through legitimate channels, Moscow spent nearly 2 years building an alternative. Old tankers, registered in third countries, crewed by nationals of non-sanctioning states, insured through obscure intermediaries. Some operating under the flags of nations with no meaningful maritime inspection capacity. By mid-2026, this network had grown to several hundred vessels operating across multiple sea routes. The Azov corridor was among the most critical. Shallow draft tankers moving refined petroleum products from Russian Black Sea ports toward Crimea and the occupied southern territories, keeping the logistics chain alive at its most vulnerable point. These were not just fuel ships. They were the reason Russian armored columns in Zaporizhzhia Oblast could still move. They were the reason Russian aviation at Belbek and Saki air bases could still fly combat sorties. Cut the fuel and the operational tempo of Russia's entire southern grouping drops. Ukraine's planners understood this when they started building the target package. The strange thing about a Shadow Fleet is that it's both hidden and visible. Hidden on paper. False registrations, shell company ownership, opaque insurance. But physically, it still has to move. And anything that moves on water long enough leaves a pattern. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Ukraine's intelligence apparatus, working with satellite imagery, OSINT analysts, and maritime tracking data shared by international partners, had essentially mapped the entire Azov Shadow Fleet transit schedule. Every vessel, every route, every timing window. The fleet was operating in plain sight, and Russia's commanders apparently believed that occupying the coastline meant controlling the information. It didn't. Over 6 weeks, Ukrainian planners assembled the target package. They cross-referenced AIS transponder data, when it was active, with satellite imagery from commercial providers. They tracked fuel load signatures, draft measurements visible from aerial reconnaissance, and port call patterns at Kerch and Temryuk. When a vessel went dark on AIS, they followed it by other means. By the time the operation order was finalized, the targeting team had confidence intervals on 19 specific vessels, Their routes, their speeds, their likely positions at 020 hours on the night of July 6th. The Magura V5 is Ukraine's primary maritime strike platform and one of the most capable unmanned surface vehicles in combat use anywhere in the world. Designed and built in Ukraine, the Magura displaces roughly 1,000 kilograms at combat load, carries up to 320 kilograms of explosive payload, and has a confirmed operational range of approximately 450 kilometers. It's fast for a surface drone, capable of exceeding 40 kilometers per hour at sprint, and it runs low in the water, presenting a radar cross-section that makes detection at range genuinely difficult, especially in sea states above 2. What makes the Magura particularly effective against the Shadow Fleet is not just the payload, it's the navigation system. The Magura uses a combination of GPS, inertial guidance, and optical terminal homing, meaning that even in a contested electromagnetic environment with active GPS jamming, the vehicle can acquire and track a target on final approach using visual lock. Against a slow-moving, low-maneuvering tanker at night, the terminal homing phase is extremely difficult to defeat. Russia had Pantsir S-1 systems deployed along portions of the Azov coastline, and some vessels in the Shadow Fleet were reportedly equipped with electronic countermeasure emitters designed to spoof incoming surface drones. Here is what nobody expected. Those countermeasures, calibrated for threats approaching from the direction of the open Black Sea, were oriented incorrectly for threats emerging from the shallow Azov approaches. Ukrainian planners had anticipated this and routed the attack vectors specifically to exploit that orientation gap. One detail that stuck in the after-action analysis. At least 4 of the Magura vehicles had their approach headings programmed to swing wide and come in from the northeast, the direction from which a vessel moving away from Russian-controlled Kerch would least expect a threat. The ECM systems on the target vessels were looking southwest. But the operation hit its first real complication around 0030 hours on July 7th. A Russian naval patrol craft, a Raptor-class fast attack boat operating out of the Temryuk Coast Guard station, detected acoustic signatures inconsistent with normal Azov traffic. The patrol craft did not immediately identify the contacts as drones, but it altered course toward the detected signatures and began broadcasting on military frequencies. The Ukrainian operators running the Kairos strike package had 40 seconds to decide: abort the approach and lose the attack window, or accelerate and accept that the patrol boat might successfully call in the contact before the Magura vehicles reached their targets. They chose to accelerate. The first impacts were recorded at 0223 hours. A tanker identified in Ukrainian operational reporting as operating under a flag of convenience registration, last port of call Temryuk, took 2 Magura strikes on its starboard quarter. The fuel load ignited within 90 seconds. Satellite imagery captured the thermal signature within minutes. Here's a take that will probably generate some disagreement. The international community's failure to enforce its own sanctions created this military necessity. These vessels were sanctioned. Their ownership was known. Their routes were documented. And yet they kept moving, kept fueling Russian operations, kept killing Ukrainians. When the legal mechanisms of economic warfare fail to function, kinetic mechanisms fill the gap. That is not a Ukrainian policy failure. It is a consequence of the enforcement gap that Western institutions chose to leave open. By 0315 hours, 6 vessels were confirmed struck. Fires were visible on satellite imaging across a 40-kilometer stretch of Azov transit corridor. Russian Coast Guard assets from Kerch were moving toward the impact zones, but the shallow draft environment complicated rescue operations, and some of the burning tankers were still moving under their own propulsion, fuel loads fully engaged, turning the rescue corridor into a fire zone. The second night, July 7th to 8th, brought a different element into the equation. While Kairos and Raid continued prosecuting maritime targets, the first UAV center executed its parallel inland campaign. Fixed-wing strike drones, a mix of UJ-22 Airwave variants, and what Ukrainian sources described as domestically produced long-range loitering munitions, struck electrical substation infrastructure across 4 locations in occupied Crimea. The targets were not random. They were selected specifically because they supported the port facilities at Sevastopol and the fuel storage complex at Feodosia, meaning the maritime campaign and the infrastructure campaign were designed to compound each other. What do you think? Does striking civilian energy infrastructure in support of a military campaign represent a legitimate military operation, or does it cross a line? This debate has run through international law circles for 2 years now, and the consensus remains fractured. Drop your position in the comments. What stands out about this campaign is how much it reflects a maturation in Ukrainian military thinking. Early in the war, drone strikes were tactical events, individual vehicles hitting individual targets, often with uncertain results. What happened in the Sea of Azov beginning July 6th was operationally sophisticated. Coordinated timing, multi-domain execution, parallel target packages designed to create compound effects that exceeded the sum of their individual strikes. This is not a guerrilla campaign anymore. This is a military that has internalized precision strike doctrine and built indigenous systems capable of executing it. The Russian response over the 4 days of the campaign revealed something important. Moscow's initial position was complete denial. No strikes, no losses, routine operations. Then, as satellite imagery began circulating through OSINT channels showing burning vessels, the denial shifted to partial acknowledgement. Some incidents, cause under investigation, no significant operational impact. Within 72 hours, Russian maritime authorities had suspended transit operations through the Azov corridor entirely. Vessels that had been moving on schedule stopped moving. That is not the behavior of a logistics network that was not significantly damaged. By the end of the 4th day, July 10th, Ukrainian operational sources were reporting a tally that exceeded 30 vessels struck across the campaign. Ukrainian officials confirmed 19 fuel tankers, 1 cargo vessel, and 1 ferry in the first accounting. Independent OSINT analysis of available satellite imagery and AIS data supported a figure in that range, with some analysts suggesting the actual number of vessels that sustained operational damage, not necessarily catastrophic loss, but loss of mission capability, was higher. The ferry confirmation was unexpected. A passenger and vehicle ferry operating the Kerch crossing, listed in Russian reporting as a civilian logistics asset, was identified in Ukrainian strike packages as a dual-use vessel supporting military vehicle movements between the Russian mainland and Crimea. Its inclusion in the target list generated immediate controversy. Russian state media used it to frame the entire campaign as terrorism against civilian infrastructure. Ukrainian military sources maintained the vessel was actively being used for military logistics transits on the nights in question. Going through the available OSINT on this specific vessel, the picture is genuinely ambiguous. The ferry's operational pattern over the preceding 3 weeks showed a marked increase in night transits and a change in manifest procedures consistent with military cargo handling. But the vessel had also continued to carry civilian vehicles and personnel during day operations. This is one of the hardest categories of targeting decision in modern warfare. Dual-use infrastructure where civilian and military functions genuinely coexist. The campaign reached a critical decision point on the 3rd night. Russian forces, now aware that the Azov corridor was under sustained attack, had begun repositioning Panzer S-1 vehicles to coastal positions optimized for surface drone engagement, and had moved additional fast attack craft into the transit corridor as both a deterrent and an early warning layer. The Ukrainian planners running the 3rd night of strikes faced a degraded approach environment. What had worked on night 1, exploiting the ECM orientation gap, would not work again. The coastal pantsir positions now covered the northeastern approach vectors, and the fast attack craft presence meant that acoustic detection would be faster and better positioned to call in contacts before they reached their targets. The Kairos unit's response was to restructure the attack into a multi-axis approach with decoy elements running ahead of the strike vehicles. Some of the Magura vehicles used on Night 3 were configured without warheads, pure decoys designed to saturate the Panzer radar picture and force targeting decisions while the actual strike vehicles came in behind them on a different bearing. It was a tactically elegant solution to a problem that had developed in real time, executed within a 48-hour window. The decoy Maguras activated Russian targeting radar, and expended the Panzer missile load on non-warhead vehicles. The following strike wave reached targets that were now radar-blind. Most people assume that drone campaigns become less effective as the defender adapts. This campaign suggests the opposite can be true, that adaptive attackers with sufficient asset pools can cycle faster than static defenders can reconfigure. The final tally, confirmed across Ukrainian military sources, OSINT analysis, and partial Russian acknowledgements, stands at more than 30 vessels struck over 4 nights, with 19 confirmed as sanctioned Shadow Fleet fuel tankers. Secondary fires from fuel cargo burned for up to 18 hours on some vessels, consistent with full or near-full load states at time of strike. Several vessels were assessed as total losses. Others sustained damage sufficient to require dry dock repair, taking them out of the Azov logistics circuit for weeks at minimum. Russian state media's coverage of the campaign was notably restrained. The initial silence gave way to framing around Ukrainian terrorism, language that has become familiar in Moscow's media playbook whenever a strike lands with strategic significance. There was no coverage of Russian countermeasures succeeding. The Coast Guard mobilization, the Pantsir repositioning, the fast attack craft deployment, none of it received the kind of coverage it would have received if Russian authorities believed it had successfully stopped the campaign. The Azov suspension of traffic was the most telling indicator. When a logistics corridor that has been operating continuously for months suddenly goes quiet, the operational signal is clear. Russia assessed the risk of continued transit as unacceptable and chose to halt movement rather than continue absorbing losses. That decision, taken by Russian military logistics commands, is the strategic outcome Ukraine's planners were targeting from the beginning. Will Russia find a way to restore the Azov logistics corridor? Drop yes or no in the comments. We'll check the satellite data and come back to this. The Sea of Azov campaign, beginning July 6, 2026, crossed a threshold in the maritime dimension of this war. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces demonstrated the capacity to execute a sustained, multi-night, multi-domain strike campaign against a distributed maritime target set, coordinating surface drones, fixed-wing strike drones, and inland infrastructure strikes into a coherent operational package. The scale exceeded any previous Ukrainian naval drone operation. The targeting precision was sufficient to consistently hit moving vessels in a degraded electromagnetic environment. And the adaptive response to Russian countermeasures on Night 3 demonstrated a planning and execution cycle fast enough to outpace the defender's ability to reconfigure. Russia built its Shadow Fleet to be invisible to sanctions enforcement. It was never designed to be invisible to a military campaign. That design assumption has now been exposed. Every sanctioned vessel still moving in Russian-controlled waters is now operating under a different risk calculation. Every port facility still supporting Shadow Fleet logistics is now a potential target. The Azov Sea was the corridor Russia thought was safe, the rear area that didn't need defending because it was already behind the lines. It isn't anymore. There are no rear areas in this war beyond the reach of Ukraine's drone forces. The Shadow Fleet learned that on July 6th, and what Russia does next, whether it accepts the logistics degradation, finds a new route, or commits naval assets to defend the corridor, will shape the operational picture on the southern front for months. Ukraine's drone forces did something in 4 nights that 2 years of international sanctions could not. They made the Shadow Fleet a liability instead of an asset. The water is no longer safe for Russia's supply lines, and every tanker captain who gets that message is one fewer link in the chain that keeps the war going. On July 15, 2026, at 14:23 local time, a Russian Mi-28N Havoc attack helicopter was running a low-altitude anti-armor patrol between Velika Novosilka and the Vremivka salient in southern Donetsk. It had no idea it was already being tracked. The Mi-28N is not a secondary asset. It is the Russian Aerospace Force's primary night-capable attack helicopter, built to hunt tanks, suppress infantry, and provide close air support in contested environments. Each airframe costs roughly $19 million, and more importantly, represents capability that cannot be easily replaced under current sanctions. The Russian aviation unit believed nap of Earth flight kept them below Ukrainian radar. They had flown this corridor for weeks. What they did not know was that a Ukrainian FPV team from the 414th Birds of Magyar Strike UAV Brigade had been studying their pattern for days, timing their turns, measuring their altitude, calculating their speed. In less than 4 minutes, one of the most asymmetric kills of the entire war would be confirmed on gun camera footage. A single Interceptor-class FPV drone, hand-assembled in a Kyiv workshop and worth roughly $400, lifted off from a concealed position near the contact line at 14:19 local time. 4 minutes before the Havoc crossed into its engagement window, the drone climbed fast on a closing intercept vector, racing toward the helicopter's predicted position over the open steppe south of Velika Novosilka. This was not a lucky shot. It was a planned engagement, a new class of Ukrainian aerial ambush that has quietly become the defining tactical development of 2026. The Mi-28N crew had no idea Ukraine had already solved the problem of engaging fast-moving rotary-wing targets with FPV platforms. The 414th had built purpose-built interceptor drones optimized not for payload weight, but for climb rate and closing speed. They had been hunting helicopters. By the time the Havoc's crew could have detected the incoming threat, the engagement was already over. To understand why this kill matters, you have to understand what the Mi-28N actually is. Designated Havoc by NATO, the Mi-28N is Russia's answer to the American Apache, a purpose-built tank killer and close support platform that entered Russian service in 2006 after years of development delays. The N variant, the night-capable version, added a distinctive mast-mounted radar dome above the rotor hub and integrated French-sourced thermal imaging modules originally manufactured by Thales. That French thermal package gave the Mi-28N the ability to operate in darkness, poor weather, and at low altitude, making it genuinely dangerous in the close ground battle. The helicopter runs on 2 Klimov TV3 117 VMA turboshafts, each producing roughly 2,200 shaft horsepower, giving the airframe a maximum speed of around 300 kilometers per hour and a combat radius of about 200 kilometers with a full weapon load. Standard armament includes a 30mm Shipunov 2A42 autocannon in a flexible chin mount, plus a mix of Ataka anti-tank guided missiles and unguided rocket pods on 4 external hardpoints. In the anti-armor role, it is a serious threat, especially when flying at low altitude in terrain masking mode, which Russian crews had been using over southern Donetsk. Russia has lost numerous Mi-28s during this war, and each loss hurts. The Klimov engines are in high demand across the Russian fleet. The Thales thermal modules, sourced before sanctions, cannot be legally replaced. Russian domestic alternatives exist on paper, but export controls have badly degraded the production chain for high-quality, forward-looking infrared systems. Every Mi-28N that burns is capability. Russia cannot rebuild at scale. The specific aircraft targeted on July 15th was flying at roughly 50 to 80 meters above ground level, low enough to complicate radar detection, low enough to engage targets quickly, but also low enough to be vulnerable to a fast-climbing FPV interceptor that knew where to wait. What this engagement reveals about the air war over Ukraine is worth sitting with. Russia deployed the Mi-28N to suppress Ukrainian ground forces and anti-armor teams. Ukraine responded not with another SAM system, not with a fighter aircraft, but with a $400 quadcopter built by volunteers. The $19 million to $400 gap is not an accident. It is a deliberate strategic choice Ukraine has been refining for 18 months. The Interceptor FPV that engaged the Havoc on July 15th belongs to a category that has no official NATO designation yet, because it barely existed 12 months ago. Ukrainian engineers and volunteers began developing purpose-built anti-aircraft FPV variants in late 2024, after Russian helicopter crews adjusted their tactics to fly fast and low, staying below Manpad's engagement envelopes and reducing exposure time over the front line. Standard FPV combat drones, the type used daily against Russian armor, are built around different parameters. A typical Ukrainian combat FPV carries a shaped charge warhead of 300 to 500 grams, has a range of 5 to 15 kilometers depending on relay setup, and flies at 80 to 120 kilometers per hour in attack mode. Against a stationary tank or slow-moving vehicle, those numbers work. Against a helicopter moving at 200 to 250 kilometers per hour at 60 meters altitude, a standard combat FPV is nearly useless. The closing geometry simply does not work. The interceptor variant solves this by trading payload for performance. The airframe is lighter. The motors are higher. KV, tuned for thrust over efficiency. The propeller configuration prioritizes vertical climb and horizontal acceleration over endurance. The warhead is smaller, typically a shaped charge optimized for penetrating thin, rotary wing structure rather than tank armor, but it does not need to be large. A helicopter is not a tank. Its tail rotor assembly, fuel lines, and engine bays are all fragile compared to armored vehicle targets. The warhead that destroyed the Mi-28N on July 15th detonated against the tail rotor assembly. Gun camera footage published by Magura V5 showed the drone closing from the helicopter's rear quarter, a geometry that minimizes the target's angular velocity from the drone's perspective, making the intercept easier to execute. The shaped charge penetrated the tail rotor hub, severing the drive shaft and destroying the blades. A Mi-28N without tail rotor authority does not land. It enters uncontrolled rotation and falls. Here is the part that seems strange until you look at it carefully. Russia has been flying helicopter patrols, knowing Ukrainian drone teams operate near the front line for over 2 years. What changed is not Ukrainian presence. It is Ukrainian capability. The Interceptor FPV class is a qualitative jump. Russian aviation doctrine had not fully accounted for. Russian helicopter crews were trained to fear man-pads, man-portable missiles with acoustic and infrared signatures they could detect and attempt to evade with flares. A small FPV quadcopter has no missile launch signature, no infrared plume on approach, and flies below the scan frequency of the radar systems installed on the Mi-28N itself. What would you have done flying that patrol if the threat you were trained to fear came not from a missile launch you could see, but from something the size of a large bird closing at 150 kilometers per hour from your 6 o'clock? The planning behind the July 15th engagement began several days earlier. The 414th Birds of Magyar Brigade maintains dedicated intelligence collection cells focused on Russian aviation patterns, flight paths, timing, altitude profiles, patrol frequency. This intelligence comes from multiple streams: OSINT monitoring of radio traffic, drone-based persistent surveillance of helicopter staging areas, coordination with Ukrainian military intelligence on confirmed Russian aviation unit positions, and ground-based visual observation posts along the contact line. The Mi-28N unit operating in the Velika Novosilka sector had been following a recognizable patrol pattern. According to information released after the strike, the helicopter had flown comparable routes on multiple previous days, using the same terrain features as navigational anchors and maintaining similar altitudes and speeds. For an FPV intercept team, that pattern information is operationally decisive. It answers 3 questions: where will the target be, when will it be there, and at what speed and altitude? The 414th selected a pre-positioned concealed launch point within the patrol corridor, close enough to achieve intercept geometry, far enough from Russian ground positions to minimize exposure for the launch team. The interceptor drone was prepped and armed before the helicopter entered the patrol area. The operator tracked the inbound havoc using a combination of visual observation and drone-mounted camera feed, calculating the intercept point in real time. One detail in the gun camera footage caught the attention of drone warfare analysts who reviewed it after Magyar published the clip. The FPV interceptor approached the helicopter from a trailing aspect at a relatively flat angle rather than a steep dive. This matters